إن أعجبك الفيديو لا تنسى الإعجاب والاشتراك في القناة.
The children of Israel leave Egypt. They travel to Mount Sinai, where they received God's law and made a covenant to be his people. Then after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses transferred his authority to Joshua and ascended the heights of Mount Nebo, and there he died. The Israelites had been waiting centuries for the promise to be fulfilled, and now it was Joshua who would lead them in their conquest of Canaan.
The land of Canaan was very different from Egypt. It was a land ruled by many independent city-states with names like Hazor, Jericho, Hebron, and Arad. The history of these cities has been divided into two major time periods: the Middle Bronze Age, matching Egypt's Middle Kingdom, when they were thriving.
Children of Israel leave Egypt. They travel to Mount Sinai, where they received God's law and made a covenant to be his people. Then after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses transferred his authority to Joshua and ascended the heights of Mount Nebo, and there he died. The Israelites had been waiting centuries for the promise to be fulfilled, and now it was Joshua who would lead them in their conquest of Canaan.
The land of Canaan was very different from Egypt. It was a land ruled by many independent city-states with names like Hazor, Jericho, Hebron, and Arad. The history of these cities has been divided into two major time periods: the Middle Bronze Age, matching Egypt's Middle Kingdom, when they were thriving and fortified by high walls. Then a sudden destruction and burning came upon the land, leaving those cities in ruins and bringing in a new period known as the Late Bronze Age, matching the time of Egypt's New Kingdom.
Since archaeologists today see no evidence fitting the account of the Israelites capturing and destroying these major walled cities during the era of Pharaoh Ramesses, skepticism about the story has become widespread.
The Exodus is a more difficult question to answer, simply because my easy answer to you, as an archaeologist, would say it didn't happen. Not in the way it's written down in the Bible. If we didn't have the Bible, we would never, as archaeologists or as Egyptologists, be able to say this happened. A mass exodus of people from one nation with a long journey of 40 years. Of course, you would have 40 years is more than a lifetime in those terms. People died, people were born, and arriving in the promised land. We have no evidence for it whatsoever. But us archaeologists, we say absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. But I wouldn't like to take a bet that we'll find that evidence.
Let's talk about the conquest. Joshua, what do you think happened with the story of Joshua?
I think that we have many sites that are destroyed. The great problem is we now know they were not destroyed all at the same time. We live in an earthquake country. There were various fault lines, and Jericho on the Jordan Valley. It's on a major fault line. There were earthquakes there. So we have a city that's destroyed by earthquake, Jericho. Megiddo, it's also on a minor fault line. We have a city that is completely destroyed, that we once thought was destroyed by the pharaoh Shishak. We now think it might well have been destroyed by earthquake. After earthquake, you have fire, very often. These don't happen all at the same time. They happen within a relatively close period, but not in a time frame that could be allotted to one man coming in with the children of Israel and doing this incredible campaign.
So that's the reason why there's no connection, is that because the time periods don't match, you can't put Joshua and Jericho's destruction at the same time.
No, Joshua and Jericho don't go together. We have destructions at Megiddo, we have destructions at Hatzor, we have destructions at Tel Rehov, a smaller site. This is in the north of the country. Amazing destructions. None of them actually fit one another. They all happened within 100 years, but not overnight. Not what you'd expect in, Joshua didn't live that long if he existed. Okay.
Is there a Jericho site that you can verify?
Sure, there is a Jericho, and there is also all the sites, can be located, or most of them can be located. So it's not a question of locating the sites, it's a question of going to Jericho and finding evidence for a city in the late Bronze Age, or evidence for destruction and a certain period of time compared to other places. Take the example of Jericho. In Jericho, there's no big city in the 13th century BC. Okay, any way you look at it.
The conquest began with the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. Joshua sent men to spy out the massively walled city of Jericho, and there they met a harlot named Rahab, who reported that all in the land had heard what God had done for the Israelites, and they were terrified. Rahab hid the spies and aided their escape to the mountains. Imagine the dread and the desperate panic of the people of Jericho. Day after day for 6 days, the people of Israel are walking around their city with the Ark of the Covenant and the sounding of ram's horns. Then on the seventh day, they encircle the city 7 times, and the priests give a long blast on their horns. The people let loose with a mighty shout. The walls come tumbling down. Allowing the Israelites to climb up into the city, taking it and commencing the conquering of the land of Israel.
And then we're told they set the city on fire.
I spoke to James Hoffmeyer about the excavations at Jericho and the evidence at the site in the time of Pharaoh Ramesses. We want to talk about Kenyon and about Jericho because my understanding is that Kenyon actually stated some things that a lot of people have somehow left out about the location of Jericho.
With the story of Jericho, we have a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty. And this stems from the fact that in the 1930s, the British archaeologist John Garstang from Liverpool excavated, found a very clear burn destruction layer that he attributed to Joshua and the Israelites. 20 years later, when Dame Kathleen Kenyon came along and excavated, she dated that level not to the time of Joshua, say 1400, but rather 150 years earlier, marking the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, a lot of people have simply said, well, Kenyon has proven that this couldn't have been Joshua's Jericho either in the 14th century or the 13th century or the 15th century. So the story of Jericho must be made up, maybe an etiology, that is a story made up to tell the origin of something, but surely there's no corresponding history behind it. Now, sadly, what many archaeologists have done is not read all of what Kenyon has said. And in fact, we do know that her excavations produced ample evidence for a late bronze, that is a level of occupation in the 15th and 14th centuries. And in fact, one colleague has written a book called Jericho in the Late Bronze Age. So very clearly there was some sort of late bronze settlement at Jericho. And Kenyon herself acknowledges that the late bronze community may well have used the defense walls from the Middle Bronze Age that were still standing, or at least enough standing to be the ramparts of the city. So if you really read what Kenyon has said, rather than what other people actually report she said, I think many colleagues, many scholars would be surprised to find out that what she actually said and what she is purported to have said by others are two different things. So clearly there was something there in the late Bronze Age, the general period of Joshua. The question is how much and how large it was, and we may never know the answer to that, because according to the biblical tradition, the city lay fallow for several centuries. And during that period of 300-400 years, till the days of Ahab, the city was unoccupied. We're told in the Bible because Joshua put a curse on it. So she argues, based on what she found, that there was considerable erosion because the site had lied fallow, no occupation for hundreds of years, and much erosion had occurred, and she claims this accounts for the loss of much of what was the late bronze site of Jericho. Although there's pottery, there are other finds, there are tombs from the late Bronze Age, no doubt about it. So the reality is there is something there in the late Bronze Age. It may not have been the largest settlement, but there was something there, and I think people have gone too far in writing off Jericho or trying to redate Jericho to fit different theories, but there clearly was something there in the 15th, 14th centuries. So I think people need to go back and re-examine what Kenyon actually said and what her reports actually contain, as well as the late bronze material discovered by Garstang himself.
John Bimson gave his views on Jericho and the idea that the destruction from the end of the Middle Bronze Age was connected to Joshua's conquest. Why has Jericho been a problem for the biblical history?
Well, ever since Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, it's appeared as though since the destruction of the Middle Bronze Age city, which she dated very early, about 1550 BC, there's not been any major city there that the Israelites could have attacked. So it isn't simply that there's no destruction level, it's that there was simply no city.
So she dated at a time period that basically was contrary to when people thought the Exodus happened?
Oh yes, her date for the destruction was very early indeed, and didn't seem to fit any biblical scenario that anyone had come up with.
Then did that cause a huge effect in what people thought about the Bible?
Well, it was Jericho and other cities. I mean, it was a cumulative effect, basically. Jericho, of course, is significant because it's one of those cities on which the Bible devotes quite a lot of narrative. It's not just a brief mention. It's a long account of how this city came to be conquered. So that's why a lot of attention is focused on Jericho. But for the view that the conquest happened in the 13th century BC, there are other cities as well that either weren't occupied or don't show signs of destruction. So Jericho was a very important piece that built towards the skeptical view, but it wasn't the only piece by any means.
So let me understand this. Kenyon and a lot of other people thought that the Exodus happened in the 13th century. Is that correct?
That's been the prevailing view since about the middle of the 20th century.
Okay, so the problem was that when she excavated the site, she found nothing at that level.
That's right. Yes, there was perhaps very scanty occupation, but certainly no city, no fortification walls that the Israelites would have found difficult. You know, if the Israelites had arrived in the 13th century, they'd have found almost nobody there, no walls to collapse. It just wouldn't have fitted the biblical narrative at all.
Well, the idea was then the Bible is false because there was no Jericho to be destroyed at that time.
Basically, yes, that's true.
So how do you solve that problem from the biblical narrative point of view?
If you look earlier, if you look at the end of the Middle Bronze Age in Palestine, then we do have a major city at Jericho. It covered about 10 acres, possibly. It was very heavily fortified, probably a double fortification wall around it. Certainly big enough fortifications to have made the Israelites feel there was no way to conquer this place. And yet it was destroyed and it was burnt. So.
And Kenyon found that evidence that the city was...
She found evidence that there had been an earthquake, and she found evidence that there had been a major burning of the city.
But did these events happen at the same time?
It seems so. I mean, it's very hard archaeologically to say that one followed immediately after the other, but it does seem as though these events happened in fairly rapid succession, yes.
So do you think that... do you think the big reason why Kenyon suggested there was no evidence was because she believed that the Exodus happened at a completely different time than what the Bible stated?
She was expecting that if there was any evidence there at all, it would be in what we call the Late Bronze Age.
The 1200s?
In the 1200s. And it simply isn't there. So her excavations helped to compound this very negative view that was developing not just from Jericho but from other sites as well.
Bryant Wood points to the same destruction at Jericho as John Bimson does, but since he does not favor shifting the dates for the Middle Bronze Age in order to connect Jericho's destruction to an Israelite conquest around 1400 BC, Wood argues that the walls actually came down in the Late Bronze Age, not in the Middle Bronze Age as most believe. He believes that the view that places the destruction in the Middle Bronze Age was caused by an error made in dating the pottery from the site. Does Joshua and Jericho go together?
Yes. When we come to the site of Jericho, the problem in trying to correlate the archaeological findings there with the biblical record is that the destruction level at Jericho has been misdated by Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated there in the 1950s. She claimed that the city was destroyed around 1550 BC by the Egyptians. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that the Egyptians were ever in the Jordan Valley at this time period. But nevertheless, that's her theory, and that's the dating she came up with. And her dating has been accepted by archaeologists and followed to this very day. Now, I've done a lot of research on Jericho. I've analyzed pottery from all of the expeditions, starting with Garstang in the 1930s, who, by the way, dated the destruction to 1400 BC and did a very fine job, in my opinion, of analyzing his pottery and coming up with that date. But that was overturned by Kenyon in the 1950s. I've studied her pottery, and there's a new expedition there run by some Italians, and they have found pottery from the time period of the destruction of the city. And all of this pottery, when you study it in detail, gives you the dating of 1400. It's late Bronze 1. There's no question about it. It's late Bronze 1 around 1400 BC.
So is this your interpretation, or is it becoming more accepted? Because people are people still leaning towards Kenyon? When was Jericho destroyed? Let's talk about the evidence at the site. When did that happen? From our dating evidence that we have, we can date that destruction to the end of the late Bronze 1 period, around 1400 BC. And that's based on mainly pottery, but we do have in the cemetery some Egyptian scarabs that Garstang excavated in the 1930s. And these are scarabs of pharaohs who ruled in the 15th century BC. And so that is supporting evidence from a documentary source, you could say. But the strongest evidence is the actual Canaanite pottery that's in the destruction layer, and that is late Bronze 1 pottery. Who determined that, or how was that determined? The dating of late Bronze 1? That pottery there, yeah. The dating of the pottery is based on my analysis. Kenyon herself never did an analysis of the pottery she excavated. She only made some off-the-cuff statements in various
articles she wrote about Jericho, about the dating. And in her final excavation reports, there is no analysis of that material, unfortunately. And so I have analyzed it, and I need to publish that, obviously, so that other scholars can look at it and realize that the site was not destroyed in 1550 BC, but it continued down to about 1400. It's very clear.
So, but the problem right now is that part of the problem is that you haven't published that.
Absolutely.
In other words, you need to get that published, because then other scholars will have to look at it and say if they accept that. Let's talk about Kenyon. Then how in the world did Kenyon come up with this date if she didn't analyze the pottery?
Kenyon's main argument for this 1550 BC date was the fact that she did not find imported pottery in that destruction level. At the time she was excavating, archaeologists were dependent upon imported pottery from the island of Cyprus, and in particular, what was called a Cypriot bichrome ware. It was decorated with black and red decoration. She did not find that type of pottery, which was in use in the late Bronze I period. And because she didn't find it, she said the city must have come to an end prior to late Bronze I. So she was making an argument from silence, from something she did not find. She did not look at the local, everyday Canaanite pottery, which she had in abundance in the destruction layer. And that's what I've analyzed, is the local Canaanite pottery, and it's clearly late Bronze I in date.
So you actually found pottery that puts it at the later date of the time of the conquest?
Yes, yes.
Well, that's amazing. That has to be published, because I think everyone else is pretty much reading the song book that it doesn't fit the time of the period.
Oh, absolutely.
The question then is, pottery is basically the types of dishes and pots that you keep grain in. Was that pottery that she was looking for from a different economic level, or was it common to the common people, or what?
The Cypriot pottery was imported, therefore it was more expensive. It was nicely decorated, so it was kind of a fine ware, you know, grandma's fine china, so to speak. And so it wasn't all that common. It's found mainly in tombs as grave goods. You know, when someone died, they would put this in the grave with them as kind of a memorial gift or something. But it's not that common in the domestic levels.
So what you're saying is that the average person wouldn't have it in the first place?
Usually not. And in particular, the area that Kenyon was excavating at Jericho, and Garstang dug in the same area, was a poor part of town. Kenyon noted this in her own reports. This was a very poor area. The houses were small, and the pottery was just common, everyday, cheap pottery, you might say. And so she made that observation, and yet expected to find expensive imported pottery in that destruction level. It just was not logical thinking, really.
Tell me about the evidence that you see at the Jericho location.
In the book of Joshua, in chapter 6, that describes the destruction of the city by the Israelites, we have a lot of details given to us. And we have a number of points that are verified by the archaeological findings at Jericho. And we see, even in the Hebrew words that were used in the account, a very precise description. For example, the Hebrew word that is used to describe the falling of the walls is the Hebrew word takathah. Now, this is always translated flat. The walls fell flat. But the Hebrew word has a richer meaning and a more descriptive meaning. It actually means the walls fell beneath themselves. Well, when the city met its end, these mud brick walls collapsed, and they actually fell down to the base of the stone retaining wall. Kenyon describes it very clearly and in detail in her excavation report. And she says the mud bricks at the base of the retaining wall came from the city wall. And for her, it had no connection with the Bible because she dated the destruction of the city to 150 years before Joshua. But there is dramatic evidence for the walls of Jericho falling, just as the Bible says, and that Hebrew word describes it perfectly. They fell beneath themselves because they had to fall and then slide down that rampart and were deposited at the base of that stone retaining wall. So even in the Hebrew words that are used, we see evidence that this is not some account that was written hundreds of years later by somebody in the exile period or some later time period. This was written down by somebody who actually saw it, and we're describing what they saw.
إن أعجبك الفيديو لا تنسى الإعجاب والاشتراك في القناة.